Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. What a way to substitute for your breakfast history. We've got an all-star lineup, as you can see, and there was my favourite anecdote, really, got to be true. You believe history professors. It was told to me by Richard Cobb, a friend of mine, when he was. It's a story of his time at the University of Wales of Aberystwyth, and a chairman of the department. I'll tell you guys this story. Chairman of the department used to regularly, you should know this, Susie, used to pick up the phone and say, "History speaking," and that's what you're going to get instead of breakfast this morning from my friends and colleagues. On my right, we have a wonderful lineup of people who had to grapple with the challenging issue of how to make history the best it can possibly be on television. Dan Jones, prolific, brilliant, compulsively readable author on The Wars of the Roses, Plantagenets, most recently, stunningly brilliant book on the Templars. Professor Suzannah Lipscomb, who's, as you'll see, worked with Dan, and we're going to be looking at a clip involving, I hope, the two of them tearing each other's eyes out, really, but trying to be mutually sympathetic about the Tudors, not really. And Suzannah's professor at University of Roehampton, wrote a wonderful book called The King is Dead about Henry VIII's will, has written a lot about the Tudors, and has a brilliant book about the voices of women during the French wars of religion in the 16th century called Voices of Nîmes. Then my beloved friend, colleague, comrade in arms and civilizations, David Olusoga, who was a filmmaker, a great and sophisticated experience before he actually was a presenter, has worked particularly on the German presence in Africa, German colonialism and the Kaiser, the First World War, and then, of course, most recently, Black and British, an absolutely path-breaking book and series about that experience. And the wonderful series, what was it called, David, about seeing history through a particular place, through a house. What was the title?
A House Through Time.
Oh, the House in Time,
House Through Time.
And that was so great that there are going to be many more houses.
I am off to film the last day of the next house
The
tomorrow.
next house,
yeah.
Okay. So we're going to tackle, we hope you'll enjoy it. We're going to, I wanted really, in my hectoring way, not just to talk in generalizations really about is history on television a good thing or a bad thing, but we want to show you some of the kind of inside stories and issues about when you do this. Because the art of history, when you write it, I think, actually, as well as when you film it, is a very paradoxical thing. It's magic, but like all successful acts of magic, it's extremely complicated. And in the case of history, it's a kind of negotiation between friendliness and familiarity and making people feel they are living for that hour in the 16th century or the 19th century or whenever, and yet respecting distance, remoteness. Part of the excitement is that people, in some basic ways, pain, pleasure, love, fear, terror, power, are just like us, but in some unrecoverable ways are not quite like us. Is it possible, by the way, to have these lights out? There seems to me a madness to have the spotlights. Is that okay? Do we care for a spotlight, everybody?
No.
No, we don't. Okay, that's what I thought, yeah.
Will it look good on television, though? That's the question.
Yeah, okay. We have one vote for glamour. You know, you're glamorous enough already. Look at these tattoos. Yeah, tattoos. So I want to, and it's a very, exactly how you shape that balance is often a matter of location. You know, are as presenter writers, are we in the picture immediately and frontally, or do we really simply act as a kind of, and I hope we'll talk about this, I'm going to show a short clip from the opening of one of the programs in the series of the story of the Jews, where I did wrestle exactly with that, with the issue of presence and absence, allowing people to be in a forgotten place, and yet taking people by the hand to say, now, here you are, there. So could we roll that first clip? Can you, that little sequence, it took, I don't know, it took us at least a week, I think 10 days to edit, actually. And there were certain things, so I want to talk about locations with all of you, but I'll just say that there were certain things about that synagogue in Slovakia that I heard about from a friend that were kind of crucial in that we knew it was going to be restored. And I wanted to get to it, actually, before it had been over-restored. And it actually has now been. And there's something, I think, about ruins that actually is very eloquent, actually, because our own memory of where we've once been is imperfect and ruined. If any of you, my favorite text about that is the opening, first chapter in Richard Holmes's wonderful book, Footsteps, about romantic biography, where he comes upon a bridge following the footsteps of Robert Louis Stevenson, and the bridge is broken. And it's a wonderful symbol of his. So I want to ask, and I should say we had all sorts of wonderful accidents. The light was perfect. That Slovakian glass spoke to vitality, not just death. I wanted to make a series that wasn't just Jews as victims and bullies, that wasn't actually shrouded by the Holocaust, but we didn't wrangle the bird. The bird flew across the camera by magic. So I don't know about you three. I'll start with you, Dan. Are there sort of locations really where, and they needn't be, the place of a Wars of the Roses battle, but the location makes you want to tear up the script and it becomes easy and it becomes natural, and in some ways you melt into the location.
I think one of the things that television does very well, as opposed to all the other media through which we can do history, if you like, be it books, be it journalistic articles, podcasts, there are more and more now than there have ever been. But one of the things that I've found history does extremely well is give the viewer the ability to step into a location that they might not otherwise have been to. So one of the most successful shows that I've ever done, which was against all expectations because it was one of the most difficult and unpromising while we were making it, was a show about British castles. I mean, you couldn't get a more basic concept. You go to a castle every episode. I walk around the castle going, oh my God, look at all this, telling some stories. And yet it has gone to sort of 30, 40 Netflix territories around the world. People watch it and watch it and watch it because simply you're going to places that people don't have the chance to go to. Yeah. I mean, that synagogue, not only did you, I suspect very few people in this room have been to, but you went to, as you said, a very specific time. Yeah. And I think there is something that TV can do that other media can't do in terms of taking a viewer inside somewhere. Now, a degree of that relies on the technical proficiency of the people making the show to show you the location in its glory or otherwise. And a degree of it relies on your talent or one's talent as a broadcaster to show what's behind the obvious, what's behind the sort of artifice. So that's one thing I think TV does particularly well. Locations.
Yeah, Susie, you were part of Hampton Court, and still are, I think, actually, right?
No.
So you're not, but you were. That's where. Okay. So I mean, have you sort of been to a place you think you know perfectly well, and then suddenly noticed something and thought, God, tear up that bit of script and actually show that particular.
I think there's certainly a sense in which when you go to places, and Dan's absolutely right, TV gives you access to places, other beers don't reach, that you can find, you can see things and that they can speak to you at the moment, and the stonework can tell the story. And it's actually one of the ways, not only does TV take you to these places, but actually it has a visual language that can show you things that you cannot see in books. And it's one of the great strengths of it. And I think it depends on the sort of show that I've been making. So there's a difference between a kind of one that's fully authored as a documentary, in which case you do actually, there is absolutely a possibility to say, right, no, this is what I need to say here. This is what this particular work is saying, or this particular building is saying. Or when Dan and I have worked together on docudramas, which we'll look at in a bit, then we tend to have worked on the scripts much more in advance. So the shooting script has been discussed and hammered through this iterative process, and diversion from the key points that you're trying to make at that time would be unwelcome by director
you
or
can't
fellow
say
presenter.
the director and the cameraman, no, I really want, 5 minutes of that fireplace.
And they'll say, yes, you can do that, but you also need to record the other bit, and then they won't use the first bit I said. So it depends on the process, the making process, and the extent to which one can author it as you go along. In fact, actually, I prefer to work from a script where you've kind of perhaps got bullet points about what you might say, and then there's freedom to act. But in some cases, you've basically pinned it down in advance.
I want to come to David. I mean, I should have come to you in a way first, because David, the House series, but also a wonderful moment in the Cult of Progress, where it surely was that one, wasn't it? Or no, maybe it wasn't. I mean, I'm just thinking of you in front of the governor's house in Calcutta, and you said this is shock and awe in architecture. It's just an absolutely brilliant moment. But I just actually want to, in respect of scripting, I'll come to you. Do we all, if we've never had this conversation, write the shots? Or you do, I'm sure, and I do, actually, even if the director's going to laugh and throw them away. But actually, I write the scripts with shots on the left and scripts on the right. Do you do that? No. Also sort of think absolutely about what might be in frame when you're writing the script?
No, I think you have to. And I work a lot on script. I mean, we also need to slightly define what we're talking about here, because we're talking about history on TV as though it were one monolithic thing. And there's a big difference, I think. Susie's mentioned doing docudrama, where you're very locked to your role as a presenter in basically narrating a drama that has the fixity and shape of drama, and that's the way it's been written. Now, I'd still work a lot on those scripts, and yes, in answer to your question, I'd absolutely work with the shot list next to the words. But there's another form, which is the essay on television, let's say, which I think you do a lot and extremely well, where there is a greater freedom, and it does rely much more on you arriving in the location and suddenly seeing something that you weren't expecting, even if you were sitting there with your list of shots and the thoughts that arrive on your desk as you're working on the script, that you need that sense of looseness and freedom from the director, from the producers, and from your own expectations of what you're going to make. Otherwise, you'd be making something very stilted.
Yeah.
And can I pick up on that? Sorry, I'm aware David hasn't spoken.
I want to come back to docudrama in a minute with your clip, actually.
Yes,
On the
but in terms of, there probably are two other forms as well, just to be completely comprehensive in our types of TV history. There's something, the discursive model. So the last days of Anne Boleyn was an example where you had different expert contributors who were each coming up with a different interpretation of an event, and then it was cut as if we were having an argument. And that's the closest, I suppose, to an academic version of history, where you're thinking about it as debate, and it's the debate that makes it compelling. And then, of course, there's the formatted versions where you're either following an event, like the King in the Car Park or the Netherfield Ball, or you've got an adventure like Dan Snow going up the Klondike, or you've got living history, where you've got 1900 house, Victorian farm. You take ordinary people, you put them in the past, you put them in clothing, and then
watch them suffer.
And watch them suffer. And all of those are compelling because of the uncertainty. But.
I want to come to that a bit. Actually, I've never been a historian much who goes for, now let us divide the subject into three, actually, or four. I think they're all the same, but they're all actually, I suppose, they're all different kind of approaches, and one emphasizes, I don't know, maybe dramatic immediacy. There's an argument, which we'll, a discussion we'll have in a minute, about whether or not actually dressing people up in what one director I work with a lot calls stick-on whiskers, actually makes things more immediate, or makes it more remote, in fact, inadvertently. But I just want to go, not to hammer this on the head, but I mean, are there times when you just wanted the House series is all about the eloquence of buildings, really, and was that your idea, or
It wasn't. No, it was Emma Willis, who owns a company called 2020. I mean, that only works if you remember that the people you're talking about lived in that house. Yeah. And I have to constantly keep reminding myself that I'm in their living room. I'm talking about someone's death, or someone's financial collapse, or their arrogance, or their mistreatment of their wife, in one case, their violent mistreatment of their wife, in the room where it happened. And there is a certain element which sounds a bit mysticky and a bit nonsense, but
Do you ever feel like a trespasser when you do that?
I think it's transgressive, and I think it's transgressive in a good way. To discuss and to read the account of a domestic violence case in the room where it took place feels weird, and it should feel weird. And if you aren't channeling or having some contact with those people, then I don't think you're working as an historian. This thing about location is that...
So we're running a séance, really?
I think there is an element of that. And I've written about this, and historians admit it to each other every now and then, that if you don't feel these people, something's not happening. Yeah. And we sound a bit like we should be on Good Morning Britain doing the tarot reading. But there is something there.
Yeah.
I think history shares a lot of its instincts and strengths with journalism, in that it's about nosing around. And if you're not nosing around, finding out something that feels uncomfortable in some way, then you're probably not really doing it right.
When have you nosed around and found something you didn't expect to find, Dan, and then put it on screen?
We did, when we was making this Castles show, we went to Lancaster, I never get the vowels right in that word, Lancaster Castle, which is bad, having worked so long on the Wars of the Roses, isn't it?
Yes, then we
Lancaster
get
Castle, you know where I'm talking about, which is still in part a working court, and has a long history as being...
I thought you were going to say working castle. I thought, well, Brexit's dividing the nation, but not that badly, yet. You know.
It's still a working court, so it has this long history in crime and punishment. When we were putting the show together, I said, we have to... The theme of this episode is about crime and punishment. And, so when we went down to the museum, and there's skulls, bridles, and all of this sort of the horror, the apparatus of justice in times gone by, and that's all quite interesting. And we had cases that had been tried in the court. We're standing in the court where they'd been heard. But the bit that I wasn't expecting, and this was a coup from the production company, was they tracked down somebody who lived in Australia, whose family way back had gone to Australia because they'd been sentenced for sheep rustling and sent out as one of the last convicts transported to Australia. And she came over, this lady, who was now a sort of district judge or something in Australia, and sat in the dock where her descendants had, from where they had been sentenced, and which had set the parameters of her entire life and family history. Yeah. And that was extremely moving for her and for me as well. And once you do quite a lot of television, you become quite hardened and cynical. Or you can become quite hardened and cynical. I don't want to cast aspersions on the rest of you. But sometimes these moments really hit you, and this was quite extraordinary.
When you're with Witness, maybe... we're going to talk about that later, with David in particular, with Living Witness. But there was a moment in that same programme, actually, in Programme 4 on the story of the Jews, where there was this, in Lithuania, there was an old fellow who'd escaped what was otherwise the annihilation of an entire Jewish community in a medium-sized town, Plungei, by being in the Red Army. And he'd come back to find no one there. And he spent a lot of his life actually carving figures of the people he'd known in wood, and he was very much in the heart of Lithuanian timberland, and called Jakubas. He's now dead, and I sat on the couch, and he wanted to tell the story of what, as he knew, he'd reconstructed it from German sources in particular, about what had happened when they'd all been taken to the edge of the forests and dug their graves and shot and fell into them. But he was sort of, he was tearing up, and you thought, maybe I shouldn't be doing this at all, actually. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this at all.
Actually, funny enough, talking about Lancaster, there's an example of that as well. I filmed there for the Witches series I made, and again, special access. We went down into the cell where these women, 20 of them, were kept. And in terms of your thought about location, Simon, that was one of those very powerful moments where you think, well, it's a tiny room, it's tiny, it's dark. We had lights, we had the door open to let in daylight, close the door, absolutely pitch black, damp. You can see you can understand why some of the people died waiting for trial in the Pendle trials of 1612. So it just, there's places speak, whether you've got witnesses or whether it's kind of the stones that are witnessing to you.
And we feel that when we go to an archive anywhere, archive of text, but you feel it even more intensely, I think. Would you like to? We're going to play a clip from one of your Elizabeth programs.
So this is, yes, I'll set this
it?
up. This is a series on Elizabeth I that Dan and I made for Channel 5. It's a docudrama, and this is the third part of the first episode. What has happened is that Elizabeth has been accused of committing treason by agreeing, speak over the plane, by agreeing to marry Thomas Seymour, again without the permission of the Privy Council. And so we come in on that moment.
So can I ask you both, did you have any say in the casting? Do you? When you have that amount of drama?
Yes. So it is interesting. When we did the Henry VIII one, I think we did have a look at some of the options, but it was more from the generosity of the director rather than it being part of our considered role. And it is interesting. In a case like that, we were working, as I've already said, very hard on the scripts. I remember before we started, I'd sent over a sort of 20,000-word dossier on Elizabeth to the director, saying these are the things we want to look at. But then, of course, the scripts are our scripts, and they're not necessarily what's said in the drama. And two things I want to pull out of that is the scaffold speech is verbatim. We know what was said. In the previous speech, we have invented dialogue, and we don't know.
Okay, so you've mixed invented dialogue and actual.
There is a mix, yes, because we know what was in the documents. We know what Thomas Parry said. We know what Cat Ashley said.
But why did you let them do, invented stuff?
Yeah, well, what you're implying, Simon, is that we have the power to change that, which isn't necessarily true.
Well, for me, this comes back a little bit to what I said earlier, which is about defining the different ways in which TV does history. And there are some which, like this, which you call docudrama, which is more heavily reconstructed than the old...
silent reconstruction.
Silent reconstructions, someone dies and a candle is blown out. That it's much more pushing towards the, let's say, the Wolf Hall style of Tudor reconstruction, except you can do it on a budget of 200 an hour.
But the trouble is, Dan, is that, our slot is history, actually, isn't it? Whereas Wolf Hall, it is drama. It's Hilary Mantel's novel.
Actually, I think Wolf Hall's quite interesting in that case because there's a category error that people make between history and historical fiction very frequently, and people make it with Wolf Hall a lot, and quite a lot of people, probably more than we naturally assume, think of it as history. And there are a lot of people who come to history through historical drama and wouldn't come to it at all otherwise. And there's certain channels that wouldn't show programs without that level of historical drama. So then when you sit down and start to make these shows, it's all very well for us to have our sort of rigorous boundaries about what is acceptable in the books we write, or if we were doing a narrated essay, as we've discussed before. But when you come to putting a drama that's got to play at 8 o'clock on Channel 5 and do 1.2 to 1.3 million, which for that channel's a good audience, you can't have that scene of the interrogation without some dialogue. And if the dialogue doesn't exist, you have to make it as best you can. Now that's when the relationship between us and the director and the exec producer comes into play, because there is or should be a level of trust and cooperation between the two departments, effectively, as to how far can we push it, how much is realistic speculation. Where possible, let's always use recorded speech. Where it's not possible, but we need it for dramatic purpose, how do we make this as quote-unquote authentic as possible? And no, it's not perfect. It's not of the historical standard that I would hold myself to when I'm writing my books, for example, but it does draw 1.2 plus million Channel 5 viewers into a program about Elizabeth I. And there's a part of what we do in our capacity as public historians, which is about outreach, about bringing people in and saying, well, if you enjoyed that, go and read Susie's book on Henry VIII's will, which will tell you much more and in finer and footnoted detail what did and didn't happen.
Have you done docudrama, David? Would you?
I've done them as a producer.
Okay, tell us about that.
Well, and by chance, the program, as you know, the program that made me want to do history when we want to be interested in art was a drama documentary, a series from the 80s called Artists and Models. I watched as a 16-year-old. And I didn't realise it was a drama documentary when I watched it. And what I'd realised now is it's a really, really good one. And having made one that really, really wasn't, I fully appreciate how difficult they are. The danger with drama documentaries, what you end up, the more money you throw in, is not high-end documentary, but low-end drama. And that line you can drift over is really, really difficult. What I think you see in what Suzanne and Dan have done is the restraint that is now there within most drama documentaries. We used to just sail off into people having long interactive scenes and try to do scenes with lots of extras, and every group of battle reenactors were conscripted into television reconstruction. That's now over, and it's much, much more restrained. It is really, really difficult to do, and it does throw up these sort of kind of near ethical issues about history and sources. So it's a minefield. I'm not, as a director and a producer and executive producer, I'm not a huge fan of it, but when it works well, it works brilliantly.
Yeah, I was, naive enthusiast of the possibilities when we made the Battle of Hastings film, the second film, and we didn't do drama at all, docudrama. We did reconstructions, and we inevitably had the reconstruction of the Battle of Hastings, lots of close-out shots of spears and Feardmen and so on. And so I was thinking about those wonderful marginal kind of meta images on the Bayeux Tapestry, where there are images of peasants actually removing hauberks from naked bodies, chopped up naked bodies. And we had quite a lot of, a lot of reenactors there. And I said, so it'd be great if they all took their kit off, really. And director Liz Hartford said, but the bank managers from Surbiton. I said, well, they probably take their kit off sometimes, really. And he said, yeah, no, not when they're doing the Battle of Hastings, they do. So instead, I said, but it won't look good. And of course, they don't take their kit off, and they're lying there, and it just looks like fat men having a snooze after a Sunday pub lunch, really. Just see these sort of enormous... And there was actually, the one time we did, well, I don't know if it was low-end drama, we did actually, in the Power of Art, we absolutely stuck to documented archival speech throughout, except one moment, and nearly killed the director for doing this. And I thought I'd actually got rid of it. It was the opening programme, which was high risk enough. It's Caravaggio, and you didn't really need... Caravaggio was such a kind of maverick and, such a wild man, not to mention a murderer, possibly double murderer. There was nothing you need to... So when he shouts out, I'll fry the balls of scum like you, was actually, a reported... That was a court record from a witness who'd heard him. And so what we really didn't need in the last scene, you probably all know Caravaggio dies on the beach on the peninsula of Porto Ercole, on the peninsula of Monte Argentario, and then is taken off. He collapses on the beach, seeing his ship sail away with the paintings, which when they arrive at the palace of Cardinal Borghese, Scipione Borghese would have given him a get-out-of-jail-free card, but the paintings have gone, he's not with them. What we really didn't need was a backlit silhouette of him going, no! The one word which was most certainly not documented. But damn director, almost a prep moment before broadcast, stuck it in again. And it was, but there I thought about, we had Alan Corduno as Rothko in the last programme in that series, who really did inhabit, he's a great actor, and inhabited the personality of Rothko, particularly in his last years, and I thought that really worked very well. But I'm struck by, mostly in the history of Britain, I thought really over and over again, I wanted to take reenactors away, actually.
I think I would say that there's a palpable difference between reenactors and the sort of actors.
Were you happy? Yeah. You were happy? She looks like Elizabeth.
Yeah, and later we have. I mean, we have a child, Elizabeth. Before that, we had Felicity. I'm forgetting names. We had Lily Cole playing her, and then Felicity Dean playing her later. I mean, really high quality actors playing, and a director who's gone on to make drama, and an extraordinary DOP who was producing out of a meagre budget things that have to compete for the viewer with people who are watching Game of Thrones and all the rest of it on with high-end budgets. And I do think the drama now has very, high-end production values, and that's a difference. And I do think also that they need to have, and that they are very good and very convincing, and that the session is about what makes TV compelling. Hopefully it's compelling partly because of the analysis we're offering, but also because of the empathy and the literal drama, in this case gore, of what you can see happening on screen as well.
David, you want to make a case for the drama of real living witnesses, really, or witnesses not necessarily to the event you're talking about, but who are in the place and of the place. Do you want to introduce your clip from Black and British? Yeah.
So it's a short clip from a series I made called Black and British, and it's about the first thing that we talked about, the power of location. But it's a location that couldn't speak unless we had an enabler. We had a contributor who we met, who was embedded in that history. The woman in this clip, Isatu Smith, is the reason this location, a slave island off the coast of Sierra Leone, is still extant. The reason it's getting UNESCO support, the reason it hasn't been consumed by the Sierra Leone River is because of her work. So her life has been dedicated to keeping this place alive and the memories of the people who passed through it alive. And it's a combination of an incredible place and an incredible woman that makes this scene work. And we could not do that. Me walking around there by myself, it wouldn't be the same. Incredible.
Yeah. Do you actually work? I mean, I try as much as I can without being a pest and getting in the way, but work with the DOP, with the cameraman actually, and talk about framing and stuff like that. And
I strictly don't, because I am a director.
Yeah.
And I try, when I'm directing, I'm directing. When I'm presenting. So partly for professional reasons for myself, I have that demarcation. But by the time we get on the field, I've written the script. That location we happen.
So you just come on and do it, and then go back out again?
But I've written everything. And the location has happened because I found it, but we don't speak to anyone.
So you don't kind of wing it any? Do you ever absolutely completely wing it when you get to somewhere, or maybe you've written and you think, no, this is really ridiculously artificial, and
there's a phrase about there's a cliche.
I do it all the time.
There's a Clausewitz's phrase: no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. No TV script should really survive contact with the location. Because if the location doesn't impact on you, it should. And I found myself as a director saying, well, we've done the script. Now go and stand over there and think about what it actually means to be here. And with art, Simon, the number, was the painting you hadn't seen in Civilizations, that when you got there, you realised you hadn't done it justice in what you'd written.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we should also be vulgar and talk about money, because the way that budgets for TV on history are going at the moment, there simply isn't the time in a lot of productions to actually do anything except turn up. The phrase usually used by directors is kick, bollock, scramble, I believe.
Not with me, though.
Of course not with you. God, you wouldn't stand for it. But we're talking about, here's some history is getting made now for budgets of 130, 140,000 an hour, which 200 used to be not very much, 300 used to be not very much, and we'll be moving under 100 soon. And at that level, what can you do? You're working with teams where, I've been out recently where you've had a self-shooting DP, so a director, producer, and camera. And sometimes they'll have been asked to do sound as well. Now, at that point, I usually have a tantrum. Not as good as yours, I'm sure. But I either say this is ridiculous and we can't work. We can't actually make what you want us to make like this. Yes. But that's the way that things are getting squeezed. And the way that it affects the final product is that there just isn't the time to understand and to work with the location. And I think that's something that when work comes through, we have to think about. Of course, it sounds like a great idea.
But they lie.
Can you actually afford to do?
Lie, don't BBC lies sometimes.
That's showbiz.
Yeah,
maybe.
Have you all had the experience of actually ordering a piece of equipment, which I certainly have? A jib, for example, kind of important one. It's big cranes on which, if you need a top shot, if you're in a cathedral, you really do need that. And not showing up, or showing up with one person who will take 4 hours to put it up. Actually being the budget changing in mid-shoots, which is unconscionable in my view. It's better to know what you can't do in advance, I think, really.
And so, I mean, Simon, I've told you the story before, but I mean, it's amazing when I've had a chance to go, when I've done series on Henry VIII, for example, and I've gone to locations and I've had the space and grace to be able to say what I want to say, what's coming to mind. That's the highest quality experience you can have in making TV. The lowest quality experience I've had in making TV was when I made a
Susie's
series in Russia last year. We were there for 5 days, and I was in the Winter Palace for 3 hours, and we were going to 5 locations. If you've been there, you know it takes about 15 minutes to move between rooms. And the script, again, all agreed in advance, written and me writing the script writers. I mean, we knew exactly what we wanted to say, very carefully considered, but then to be delivered in absolutely no time. This is going to be when I realized later what had been assigned to me that day was 50 pieces to camera, which...
What?
Yes, which to give a piece to camera is one of those bits where you just see us talking, but you have to frame it in more than one size, and there's room for human error, i.e. mostly mine, but also obviously...
Traffic will be going past.
Yes, noise.
The hair blows around as well, doesn't it?
If it's outside, yes. Noise, or the zoom wasn't quite right and it wasn't sharp, or the sound is not happy, whatever it is. So you end up doing each one several times. And that's even if you get the words perfectly, and you're happy with them from the first time. And Dan is very good. And it was obviously an unrealistic number. Up until that point, I reckoned the most I'd ever done in one day was about 17, and that was a sort of like high 5 day. And that day I did about 30. But they were all, just totally rushed. It was like, do it, okay, and move on to the next one. So it was it was a nightmare. And that was the perfect example of there being a tiny budget. And so they had allowed us to go to, I'm getting angry thinking about it, allowed us to go to the Winter Palace, one of the world's great locations, with not enough time to do it justice, and not enough time to respond to it or to be reflective in any way. Those, I won't name and shame, but sometimes there are production companies you think, well, I won't be working with them again. That's just how it goes.
Before we go, I want to show one very short clip to finish off with before we have questions from you. Just very quickly, we've heard nightmare moment, because of budget or because of magic moments you weren't expecting to be, and you think, this is why I'm doing this. So magic moments from 3 of you, and I'll give you mine in a clip. Magic moment?
I didn't realise it was a question. I thought you were introducing your clip.
No.
My magic moment I was thinking about, I went to the beaches of Dunkirk with a veteran, now dead, called Vic Viner, grandfather of Kath Viner, who's the editor of The Guardian, and stood with Vic, and he described what he'd experienced at Dunkirk, rowing people from the shore. And he said, over there was people, taking shelter in the dunes. I saw a guy walk into the sea, say, I'm going home. Anyone who's seen Chris Nolan's film Dunkirk, this was dramatising that. He said, over there was the destroyer. He said, I remember it was over there because my brother was on it, and a bomb went down the funnel and he burned to death. Over there was such, just in passing. But in front of us were cycling, young families enjoying the beaches.
So that extraordinary thing I'd hear now and then.
Yeah,
really.
And to bring it to life is what television does when it does things best.
I'm feeling that magic right now, Susie.
Again, it's bringing people of the past to life. So at the moment that comes to mind is a moment where I was at Hever Castle, and I was with a prayer book in which Anne Boleyn had written, and in which she almost certainly had with her in the tower in the weeks before she died, the days, the moments, the hours before she died. And even thinking about it, it was, you get the tangibility of history, that I'm holding something, albeit with gloves or whatever, but I'm holding something that Anne Boleyn held possibly the night before she died. And for, that just blows me away.
David?
It'd probably be the sequence you were alluded to earlier about the Day of the Dead in Mexico City, where we just went to the house of a normal woman in Mexico City, Dona Josefina, whose husband had died 3 months earlier, and she'd built the traditional ofrenda, this altar to his memory with his clothes and his favourite food all laid out. And her and her family were strongly of the belief that his presence was with them for 24
Yes.
hours. And it was a great moment because they were so beautiful and generous, and because I did a piece of camera I'm really proud of, where I think for once did express what I felt and what I felt about them in that
once?
moment. Well, for once in a way where I think it
all
all
the
came
time.
across.
You do all the time.
Oh, thank you.
So very interesting that actually all these magic moments have been about, I think, what partly we all reason, not to presume to speak for you all, became historians, is the sense in which the dead have not gone at all, that they're walking among us, really. Their presence, albeit sometimes muffled, sometimes direct, sometimes lodged in objects, sometimes ghostly in buildings, are with us. We are the sum of our endless histories. And I'll just close before we have a bit of questioning with a clip, very short clip, at Gettysburg, from a series I love and which I feel everybody underrated, including us, actually, called it was made in the year of Barack Obama's election, and we followed that campaign around. That may have dated it, but it actually dealt in 4 films with the 4 subjects, which are still a fortiori, extraordinarily exacting, and at the heart of American politics: religion, war, immigration, and the environment. This was from the program about war. And we went to Gettysburg, which was a battle which took place in the height of the summer. This was a shoot in early March. It was freezing. It was raining. I had galloping flu. It was one of those times I didn't want to be there. I wanted to go. I sat sulking in the car. They said, well, you have an umbrella. I thought, oh, screw the umbrella. And then I got out, actually, and there were statues. So this were kind of, fake ceremonial statues rising out of the mist and the mud. And I was completely there. And I was sort of possessed, actually, by what was happening, and did a completely unscripted piece to camera. And you'll notice a wonderful bit of editing. We've not talked about editing very much, but an absolutely brilliant piece of mixed editing on site. So we'll finish with that, and we'll have 1 or 2 questions. Thank you. Yeah. Well, you didn't see the mix there, actually, but actually we were standing in a gully and there was a Matthew Brady fit and so on. Good. Anyway, thank you, friends and colleagues, so much. Over to you, if you any questions at all. There are microphones. Here's a lady down here, and then I'll come to whoever it is at the back. Come to you next, sir.
I was just wondering to what extent, if at all, you have to decide or struggle with the decision between whether your primary objective is to entertain or to inform in what you do.
David?
I think it's always a bit of both, but I think the overriding thing is to make people emote. It's to make this stuff immediate, make these places seem relevant. And I think if you do that right, if you do the transportation thing of making these people seem real again, making the things that they live through seem vibrant and important and critical again, then both of those things happen by volition. So for me, it's about immersion, it's about immediacy, and it's about truth. I mean, these things happened. Gettysburg was hell on earth for a day in 1863. Yeah. Bunce Island, slave fortress for 150 years, was like a charnel house. If you can't get that across, then there's no point worrying about entertainment or information, because it's about truth and immediacy.
The great historical writers, I think, at some weird level, Thucydides was an entertainer. We actually know Herodotus was. Herodotus actually spoke, or now it's thought sung, his histories out loud at festivals, actually, in ancient Greece. So the classicists tell us. So this sense, actually, of what we now call entertainment, but a kind of showy companionship. It's a very, we'll all, again, disagree with me if you can, but it's actually harder than it looks, this presenter business. My 3 friends here are brilliant because they make it look not as hard as it is. And we've let you into some of the problems. But one thing is that you have to be both a friend to you have to be invitational to people who may know nothing about the subject, young, who, it hasn't happened to be one of the modules for GCSE. But you can't be creepily matey, or else you're just some awful person who won't stop going on about Oliver Cromwell in a pub. So you also need to be an authority. You need to get trust. And I think we wrestle with that all the time, don't we? I mean, on this.
Yeah, I think it's set up as a dichotomy, entertainment or information, and really it's the two things exist together. And the question you should always, you're working in television. Why are we putting this on television? Because television does some things brilliantly well. It does engagement brilliantly well. It does intimacy brilliantly well. It does big, beautiful kind of panorama brilliantly well. It does education spectacularly badly and depth spectacularly badly. David and I were talking earlier, and David, your phrase was, it's a shop window, and it's a way to draw people into subjects, to put across as much sort of depth and accuracy as you can, but knowing that there are limitations built into the medium. And so long as you're aware of that and you try and make good telly and be as truthful as you can, then I don't get too hung up on on that particular question.
Because it's part of an ecosystem. What we do in television is there's also the publishing industry, there's places like where we are today. The proudest moments for me is when someone said, I went to that place that you filmed at.
Yeah.
I got up on Sunday and got in the car and went there.
Yes.
Or I went and bought that book.
I looked at that painting,
Yeah, and people go to galleries, people go to, 4 million people go to National Trust properties every year.
Yeah.
And part of that is because these things are part of our sense of national self-identity, partly because TV's a big part of the ecosystem, saying these incredible places are here and you can go and be them.
Yeah.
So that sort of remembering that we are a part of a history ecosystem, I think is critical.
I'd like to slightly disagree with Dan, which never happens, but
usually spectacular, isn't it?
when we work together as scripting partners, Dan is very good at the story arc, and I'm not going to repeat the phrase I used the other day, but I focus a lot on making sure that we're covering the history as much as I want to. And that is partly because of what we've worked on together, which falls into my area of expertise more than Dan's. But the fact is, all of us are historians, so we all absolutely have a rigorous commitment to historical integrity, and that's the difference. It's so that I actually think, I'm not saying it's a dichotomy, but I do think that the whole business of making TV is actually that struggle. It's that struggle of saying, yes, I want to convey something that I know intimately well, and I want to convey it with all that depth, but I've also got to do it in a script of 25 to 30 pages because it's over an hour, and I've got to keep the audience with me so they don't turn over if there are breaks or whatever to something else, and that's the challenge, and that's why it's so blooming difficult.
I would also respectfully disagree a bit with Dan about doing education spectacularly badly, because I think all of us, including, certainly including you, are thinking about where the questions can arise in the story. It's always it's a tricky thing, because the story is what's going to keep behinds in seats and keep people watching. But we all sort of design the narrative arc of an hour so there'll be moments where actually we do what historians do, is actually have you ask often uncomfortable questions, really, about what you see. There's a gentleman in the back, and then I'll come to you. Is that the last question? Gentleman or a lady? I don't know. Yeah, someone at the back.
I've got the mic
Hello.
here. Yeah,
Yes.
Good morning. Yeah, leading on from the first question, we're now in the position to compare recreated history with actual history. So the King's Speech, for example, I find that the combination of the speech plus Beethoven to be more compelling than actually going onto YouTube and hearing the King's Speech. So similarly with Gary Oldman and the We Shall Never Surrender speech, we've got the opportunity now of not only hearing Churchill but seeing him as well, and we'll never get that opportunity because Parliament wasn't recorded. So it seems to me now that we're do better.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. Raise a question. I'm going to get this other question from a lady in front, and then we'll very quickly address both. But yes. Oh.
So Mike, just coming to you.
Quick comment then.
My comment is that about docudrama, TV drama, and all the rest of it, is that actually it comes down to good teaching, because you're there, you are teaching, and you're giving somebody an idea that they can go and explore further. So the basic point is that as historians, you're teachers.
That's a lovely point. Thank you very much. And I think actually some of us spend our time trying in teachers who are my heroes, school teachers, to find ways in which they can feel happy about storytelling as a way of posing questions to 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds. Your question at the back actually is Gary Oldman. I actually hated that film. And I think if I would have liked it, I would have got to the point where Churchill suddenly finds himself on the tube, wasn't it, or something, with salt of the earth types. That actually, the fact that his experience with the regular people got him, took him out of his kind of drunken slumber, is a grotesque distortion of actually what happened. So I don't know, are our tripwires of anxiety exaggerated about that?
We're speaking to what I call a category error, easy for me to say, category error earlier on, which is that you've mentioned 2 movies.
Yeah.
And there is a continuum, isn't there, between the movie here and the archive there, in which, as historians, we occupy a sort of central space, which tends to be taking the material and building it into stories of some shape. Eventually you get out of really what's our realm into the realm of movies, and the Churchill movie doesn't, I haven't seen it actually, so I'm not going to talk about it, but I talk about movies and TV shows that I have seen. Some have greater regard for history than others. But I wonder whether we should be holding up historical movies to the same standard as docudramas, to the same standard as documentaries, to the same standard. This is a point I've now banged on 3 times.
That's why we'll be here next year at
Still
the same
talking.
time, same place, to discuss that very point. I'm so sorry. Historians are subject, even historians, to the tyrant time, and so must we be. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, my brilliant colleagues.